Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our very last day of the Atlantic Forum Autumn Conference 2021. Today, I will be a moderator of panel Beyond the Weather, the security impact of climate discontinuities. As we may all know, the climate change is real. I am saying this because despite its seriousness, the biggest challenge that had to be tackled was the trust of society that something like this actually exists. The science was here since, let's say, 1980s. People were listening to science and experts that the climate change is happening, but they started to understand it only a couple years ago, especially the fact that we, the human beings, have a considerable stake in this change. Today, it is not a delusion that the climate change is a serious issue, that it impacts our lives, and much more. For example, security framework and NATO. Because of climate change, we witness serious droughts, floods, immigration, and probably the most important aspect, which is not oil, but always be the water. I think that I just mentioned more than 10 times words such as serious, important, significant, and still it is not enough for expressing the urgent need to tackle this phenomenon. This panel will address the impact of climate change on security and on NATO, but we will not be able to solve the whole issue being climate change here within 70 minutes. Therefore, I asked our speakers beforehand to prepare one key message or vision to address the question: what is the most crucial challenge that NATO faces in terms of climate change? And what actions should be taken into consideration to better tackle this long term discontinuity? In other words, what is, in their view, the most challenging for NATO in terms of climate change and what NATO can do better to address this issue? After sharing their vision, we will be then able to easily flow into the discussion where we will be deeper elaborating on their messages and recommendations. This panel aims to be as interactive as possible with our audience, with you. Therefore, if you are watching right now, do not hesitate to write your questions on Slido for the question and answer session that will follow after discussion. There was also developed a really simple poll, which will navigate the panel in the real time. So jump on Slido right now and change the dynamic. The takeaway will be then wrapped up at the end of this panel. Let me introduce our four speakers. The first one is Tom Middendorp, who is a retired four-star general of the Royal Netherlands Army. He served as a chief of defense of the armed forces of the Netherlands between 2012 and 2017. Currently, he is the chair of the International Military Council of Climate and Security. He organized two large future forces conferences where he introduced an ecosystem approach to security and offered defense as a test bed for innovation resulting in many promising new initiatives. He also advises the Hague Center for Strategic Studies as a principal expert. The second one is Vice Admiral retired Ben Beckering, who is former Netherlands military representative to NATO and EU. His career was around planned and executed humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations from the sea, both in command of ships and seagoing staffs, in East and West Africa and the Caribbean. His time around Somalia can be characterized by a decrease in number of piracy-related events and not one single successful attack by pirates. The third one is Elisa Say, who is working in situational awareness integration team of NATO's Situation Center at the NATO headquarters in Brussels. Her expertise lies on climate change and security issues, as well as analyzing hybrid threats in the information space. She is part of NATO Young Staff Network, where she leads the Climate Change Hub. She's a research lead with a strong data analytics background who has worked on high-level analysis and the reports for NATO's leadership on all geopolitical topics. Last but not least is Sophia Chefchuk, who is an independent researcher, analyst, and project manager in diplomacy, foreign policy, and security. She's particularly interested in climate diplomacy, climate security and resilience, climate justice, and feminist foreign policy. She has experience in working as a research assistant at the European Parliament, a researcher at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and an analyst and event manager at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. So let me give a floor to our first speaker of this panel, being Elisa Say. So Elisa, what is the most crucial challenge that NATO faces in terms of climate change?
Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be part of this conference, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to this panel. So obviously, or as you very well elaborated already, undeniably, climate change has not only become a threat multiplier, but even more so, might become the main source for tensions in the global security environment in the coming decades. Some of you might have seen the recently published report from the US intelligence agencies, which highlights the competition over resources, which will increase whilst cooperation between countries will decrease, leading to more tensions globally. After 2030, the effects of climate change will exacerbate geopolitical flashpoints. And obviously, international organizations need to find a way to address this challenge and, more importantly, find ways to overcome it. So, Marie, your main question was for this panel, what would be the most challenging for NATO in terms of climate change, and how do we address this? Let me answer this in two parts. Firstly, I think when we talk about NATO as an actor in this field, I think it is always crucial to acknowledge the higher level of intergovernmental action that an organization based on consensus can achieve, which in NATO's case ultimately lies with the nations and their will to work together, agree on ambitious goals, but even more so, commit to them and stick to them. This is their challenge and task as an alliance. But secondly, for NATO as a place where people every day work so hard to assess problems, threats, and risks so the alliance can tackle them, here the challenge for me is to overcome the threat, this problem of breaking the threat of climate change down to a definition and a clear set of indicators that we can track, monitor, assess, and lastly, find adapt ways on how to address and overcome them. It's what we at NATO do so well with many other threats, be it conventional or hybrid. So this is, I think, the challenge for NATO. How do we define climate change as a threat that we can tackle? And obviously, it's such a vast topic. Where to start? What is relevant for NATO? And here, in my view, I would offer two lenses of assessments for NATO to tackle and play its part in overcoming the threats of climate change. The first lens is the direct impacts of climate change. How does climate change impact NATO and SACEUR's area of responsibility directly? We've seen heat waves and floods in North America and Europe, especially this year, and they seem to increase every year. And it shows that allies are not exempt from extreme weather events, many of which can directly be linked to the developments of climate change in the last century. The Arctic could see an ice-free summer before 2050. From a military perspective, it is important to highlight the logistical threat of climate change, the effects of which can damage military installations and critical infrastructure, hinder operational readiness and reinforcement, or create a need to divert capabilities and change economic and geopolitical calculations for the military. This is where we have to assess, monitor, and track the direct impact, which can cause civil emergencies in several NATO countries at the same time. And now coming to the second lens, which might become even more important for us to address as a threat multiplier, and this is the indirect impacts of climate change on security. The US report that I mentioned earlier highlighted how regions around the equator will suffer most, to the point that land will become uninhabitable. Last year, widespread rainfall in East Africa and abnormal dryness and drought in Southern Africa has, for example, led to an unprecedented threat to food security. And this, in turn, can lead to conflicts over territorial security, be it because of droughts or rising sea levels. Equally, climate change is already and will further fuel resource conflicts, which often lead to massive migration flows, which in turn allow human trafficking and sexual abuse to flourish. The moment is compounded by the current impacts of the coronavirus pandemic. These indirect factors also need to be defined for NATO, monitored, assessed, in order to be able to address them. So in conclusion, I think the biggest challenge for NATO lies within defining the problem of climate change as a security risk, to a point where we need to establish a set of indicators to measure the direct and indirect threat for NATO and allies. Don't get me wrong, I think that NATO should equally also play its role in reducing emissions and help mitigating and combating climate change as a whole. But if the question is what NATO can do, I think we should stick to what NATO was created for and is best at, keeping over 1 billion people safe. This is why I believe NATO must get ready to face the security challenges that will come with climate change by defining the risk in order to become resilient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I totally agree with you that what is relevant for NATO and what we have to track, define, monitor, and assess. So now I would like to ask for the vision and a message to our second speaker, who is Tom Middendorf. So Tom, what actions should be taken into consideration to better tackle this long-term disconnect?
Well, thank you. And well, I completely agree with the previous speaker, so I hardly need to speak. But I would say these are the weeks of climate protest marches, of apocalyptic forecasts, of interest groups calling for action. These are the weeks where the whole world is watching what's happening in Glasgow. And I was there last week. And I hope this will be a week of new actions, of next steps to take, and not just calling for actions. What COVID crisis showed us is that our world is globalized and interconnected, and that changes in one part of the world immediately impact on other parts of the world. So we cannot hide behind national boundaries, behind oceans, and behind sea dikes, like in my country. We live in a global village, and we're in this together, whether we like it or not, which means that we need to solve this together, despite all our differences. This is also the period of the tipping points, and the IPCC warned us that we are passing several tipping points, points of no return, like species being extincted or the polar cap melting away. We are facing an increasing gap between demand and supply. Our world population is expected to increase with another 50% this century to 11 billion people, all needing water, food, and all kinds of other materials. In the meantime, we are running short of those. So we are facing a period of increasing shortages of water, food, and all kinds of minerals, triggering all kinds of tensions. Very alarming. Now, the challenge for NATO on the short term is to mainstream climate change in their policies, to start a period of transformation. Climate change in the security community has long been neglected and underestimated. When I addressed this issue 4 years ago, when I was still the Chief of Defense, I was the first active serving general ever to address this. And it created a lot of fuss. It's the first time ever I went viral on the social media with a lot of political debates, and I even got a nickname, the Green General, a name which, by the way, I wear with honor. And I see at this moment, I saw that the discussions about climate and security, about this nexus, were very polarized. There was a fear of securitizing the issue. But now that's changing, the tide is changing. We published our World Climate and Security Report in Munich, in the Munich Security Conference, and it triggered a lot of debate on the climate security nexus. And it's great to see the EU and NATO not only recognizing the nexus, but also starting to develop policies on it. And it's also great to see countries picking it up. And Eliza just referred to the 4 reports written by the US. These are not only reports from a defense angle, but also from the intelligence communities and also from Homeland Defense, which shows that there is an increasing demand for a more comprehensive effort in countering climate change. And I see more and more countries picking this up. But our challenge is, on the short term, is to make this movement wider, to widen the net, because there are still many, many countries, also within NATO, that don't give this a very high priority and that still need to be convinced of this nexus between climate and security. But it needs to be. We need to be part of a comprehensive effort. And we all know that, and we should start to recognize that, because climate change as said, acts as a kind of a risk multiplier in fragile regions. But not only that, it also changes geopolitical dynamics. It leads to increasing calls upon the military for disaster relief and humanitarian aid. It affects our vital infrastructures. And it requires defense organizations to predict, to mitigate, to adapt, and to cooperate. Now, what's the bigger challenge on the longer term? I think the longer term challenge is to mainstream that climate change into our policies and into our capacity building. And I think there are 4 areas where NATO can contribute to dealing with climate change. And the first one is forecasting. We have very, very powerful intelligence services all looking at these fragile regions. And these fragile regions are the regions hit hardest by climate change. Now, when we recognize climate change as a root of conflict, I think it makes sense for the intel services to address this in every estimate that they make. A second area would be on mitigation. The defense organizations are in any country, they emit more than half of all the emissions of the government. And they are often the largest single emitter in any country. So they have a responsibility to take when it comes to emission reductions. And I think we should see this as an opportunity. I think the new green technologies that are now developing in a very, very rapid way, leading to all kinds of transformations, for instance, in the automotive industries, I think they can help us to improve our self-sustainability. They can help us to deploy units that don't need big logistical supplies, but that can become more self-sustaining in their energy, in their water supply, and in their food supply. So I think we need to embrace these technologies, and I think defense can be a driver for innovation on this. A third area would be the area of new partnerships. As we all know, this is not a defense problem, but defense needs to be part of the solution, which means that we need to cooperate with NATO, with EU, but also cooperate with the fragile regions and fragile countries around us to help them become more resilient against climate change. And the last area I would like to mention is adaptation. We need to adapt geopolitically because our environment is changing. With the melting of the polar cap, for instance, a new geopolitical arena opens up. We need to adapt more operationally in the missions that we do, become more climate sensitive, and we need to adapt in our facilities and our capabilities. For instance, by protecting our harbors and our coastal facilities against the impacts of climate change. So all of this requires us to mainstream it into our policies and the capability developments. Thank you.
Tom. Thank you also for addressing COP26 at Glasgow, because I think this is really relevant to today's panel, and also mentioning social media, because I think it's really impressive what you said, that you went viral 4 years ago. So I think that also social media are quite changing the dynamic of how people can know about the climate change and what is happening, and also it helps science a lot. So I would like now to ask our third speaker, being Sophia Chefchuk. So in your view, what is the most challenging for NATO in terms of climate?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me here. It's a great honor and pleasure to talk to all of you. And surprisingly enough, I'm going to agree a lot with what previous speakers have said, but I will try to add upon coming from my perspective and my area of expertise, which being gender, climate, and security. I would also love to start from the COP26 and mentioning that it's not only the very good moment right now that we are talking about this during the time when the protests are happening and the negotiations are taking place in Glasgow, but it's also the first COP when climate security has actually been discussed. Surprisingly enough, it has not been discussed at previous COPs. And it's the first COP which hosted the NATO Secretary General, which I think is quite a good development and shows the importance of climate change and the role NATO plays in it. So looking at what NATO already has committed itself to, has been the biggest focus has been around the greenhouse gas emissions, around trying to transition to more biofuels, solar panels, creating the action plan for the NATO member states and allies. So I think that NATO already understands what climate change is and that it's actually happening and that NATO can have a contribution there. However, there are some limitations as to NATO's vision, which I will try to address right now in my speech and try to focus on 3 areas. So the first one would be trying to reconsider what security actually is and in the new climate disrupted world, and try to re-equip accordingly. And as previous speakers already were mentioning, it's basically about trying to mainstream climate throughout all the policies, throughout the capacity planning, throughout the operational strategic visions, but also throughout the staff recruitment, trying to basically not having a climate as a separate issue on the NATO board, or trying to create, as there were already discussions of creation of the Center of Excellence in Canada on climate security. So there should be ensured that those things are not discussed separately, but are discussed all together from within and trying to be included in whatever type of discussion is happening at NATO. Second one would be moving beyond the reactive posture towards climate security, towards more preventive action. The fact that we are still talking here, it means that there are still things that we can do in order to prevent climate change effects from being that drastic as they could have been. And NATO has a crucial role to play here. So far, the responses have been mostly focused on preparedness efforts and adaptation, mitigation, which is, don't take me wrong, very important. And I think we have to start talking about them right now. However, we still can do something in order to preempt and to ensure some management actions that can be taken to prevent the climate change effects from being that harsh as they could have been. And the role NATO could play here is potentially trying to adapt a natural engineering within its array of activities, meaning that NATO can become a vessel for climate adaptation mitigation in order to ensure that the food security, water security, which Tom has been mentioning before, is not going to have that drastic effects as it could. And in order for all of this to happen, of course, NATO, due to its unique nature, cannot do it alone. And therefore, I would love to also point out towards the cooperation issue and trying to ensure, which NATO has already been doing for a long time, trying to cooperate with other international organizations such as the European Union, the United Nations, the OSCE. I would also try to maybe put a bomb out there and try to mention the cooperation with China and Russia. The second one probably being a bit more problematic, but cooperation with China would be significant in order to ensure that the climate change response is time-wise effective and brought there altogether, which I understand is not the easiest one, but I think the discussions would have to start right now. And then also about the inclusion of women and young people. So there has been already the participation of youth in the 2030 thinking process of NATO. Women, peace and security agenda has been high at the priorities level for NATO, but they should also be part of the climate security discussion. And I'm happy that we have at the panel Elisa, who is one of those leading the discussions from NATO within, and we should have more people like those being engaged in the whole process. And I would love to conclude with my key message, which has also been shortly touched upon Tom before. It's about the whole militarization of climate change. I think we should try to avoid this from happening because climate change is a very sensitive issue, and we know that at the core of the whole problem, there are a lot of vulnerable people. And if we try to militarize the response, there might be more crisis happening out of that, more threats appearing. Therefore, we need to try to climatize the security policies rather than try to securitize and militarize the climate action, which I think has also been one of the key messages that the NATO 2030 young leaders were trying to bring with their reports. Thank you very much for the attention.
So much for mentioning 2030, NATO 2030, because this is also why kind of we are here as Atlantic Forum, providing a platform for young people. And this is also why we are now discussing the climate change. And I totally agree with you that, for example, Russia and China are posing a really serious challenge to NATO, and that there should be the mutual relation of the climate change, and that we should play more together and speak about it together. And last but not least, I would like to ask Ben what NATO can do better to address this issue.
I think, first of all, thank you very much. And what a fantastic seminar this is. And thank you for allowing me to contribute. NATO can do an awful lot of things. But I think the first thing to recognize is that NATO also does face considerable challenges. And I throw in the elephant in the room. I think solidarity and unity, which is always the issue in NATO, will play an important role in this discussion as well. Let me try to explain. To me, climate change is the single most important driver of instability and insecurity. Whether it's droughts or floods or storms or heat waves, whether you live in moderate Arctic or tropical climates, whether it's urban or rural, whether it's in river catchments or on the river deltas, everybody and everywhere we will be affected by climate change, with the direct result of poverty, famine, suffering, migration, crime, terrorism, regional conflicts, and perhaps even also flaring up global strategic competition. So whether we like it or not, it is a big security issue. And even if we could solve the climate change or revert the climate change to better conditions, still there will be lots of security issues remaining. Think, for instance, about those nations who will lose a lot of oil revenues and become desperate to seek for other ways. Or see those nations who see an opportunity in an energy transition and start a whole chase for rare earth materials. And I've recently read an article about the Congo. You don't want to live in the Congo at the moment. It's complete chaos. So there's lots of security issues, even if we are embarking on the energy transition. What I would say is what we need as a world is a rules-based international order. Now that's there, but it's contested by many actors, state actors and non-state actors. And even I think the keepers of the rules-based international order, let me say the West, US, Europe, we're not so aligned as well together. So who is now making sure that we have a rules-based international order that can act as some sort of a referee in what we need to do to tackle the climate change? Now, NATO has always been a staunch partner of can and have to do things. Allow me to make three perhaps somewhat critical observations and then give you a few considerations that I would like to hand over. There's a golden rule in my profession and that of Tom's, is that when you've been relieved and retire, you are relieved of the watch and somebody else is the watch. So it's not my position to then tell people what they should do, but I give you some considerations. First, some critical observations. NATO, and I think Elisa mentioned it as well, is a sum of 30 sovereign nations. And at the moment, I think they certainly are not always aligned on important issues, and climate change is one of them. So hence, solidarity and unity will become crucially important. NATO always is also a military alliance, and requires a solution, and I think Sophia and also Tom mentioned it. But it goes even beyond a whole of government approach. It requires a whole of society approach. Everybody needs to dip in. And here comes the third observation I have, critical observation. NATO is perhaps not the most respected, well-seen, well-invited guest in a whole of society environment. Not always are we seen as a partner in many crises around the world. That is something that NATO has to take into consideration. Now, in order to maintain relevance, NATO must act, and a lot of examples have already been named, and I I think my observations are very much, my considerations are very much in line with it. First of all, I think what NATO can do is direct the intelligence communities, which come together in a NATO-wide picture, to focus on the causes and the effects of climate change. My belief is that if you understand climate change, if you understand the effects that are coming, you can somehow, somewhere predict the effects and take relevant and timely action. This is something that is very important to do from now. The second thing I would like to say is that NATO has an unrivaled and very tested planning capability to work out contingency plans. Let's do that, and let's work out contingency plans for all those areas, all those regions, but also all those events that we think may happen. Third, I think NATO now needs to truly invest in operational level partnerships. Who will we meet in all those areas where we need to act to maintain stability and restore security? And can we already in our planning phase work with them alongside? And that includes organizations like NGOs who will find some reluctance in working together with NATO, but we must approach them. Third, use NATO's equally well-developed standardization and planning processes, defense planning processes, to stimulate a true green revolution in military affairs. It's not only good to keep ourselves resilient, but also it will, I'm sure, increase our operational effect once we achieve that. And if we become the leaders in that, it will benefit us significantly. Not only are the military a huge polluter and user of fossil fuel, we're also, the military in total, are big investors. We spend a lot of money on a yearly base, so let's spend that money wisely. And last but not least, I would argue that let's focus on not so much on the large-scale wars, but let's focus on a flexible mix of crisis response with a combination of presence in those areas that are likely to be affected, humanitarian assistance, training and advice, also training in a green way of doing our business, and use the deterrence. Use for deterrence our tripwires and standoff weaponry. That's a whole wide range of things that NATO can do. And I listened into the ASG van Weel earlier on. A lot of things are already in progress, and that's good to see. But I think we need to step up. I think NATO is well placed as an organization to become a leader in many of those fields. But we need, and that's the internal threat, we need to overcome certainly the diverging opinions within the nations. If we can manage that, I think NATO can retain its relevancy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. And thank you for mentioning, for example, that the climate change is driven by insecurity, and all of us is kind of attached to this change and to this paradigm that has to be tackled. And now I would like to move to the discussion, because all of you mentioned really nice points and what NATO should or shouldn't do, and how we can tackle the climate change together. Which leads me that all of you quite mention togetherness, that how also the NATO is working. It's because there are 30 allies which should work together and tackle this issue, where actually it's quite beyond the NATO, because all the globe is included in the climate change. And my question would be, so even though there are 30 allies, it seems to me that there is quite polarization in with the policy making and in how states are actually acting towards the climate change. Some of the states are leaders, some of states are followers, and some see it in a totally different way. So can you probably elaborate on this polarization, and how can we actually enhance that we can actually be together in this combat against the climate change? So I don't know who of you would like to take floor to elaborate on this. Yeah. Maybe, yeah, Ben, that you were speaking the last one.
Yeah, no, and I think, and I mentioned that we have to stick together. We have to find partnerships, because it's all about the whole society approach. But within that, I would argue that NATO must stick to its origins, and I think if NATO is able to predict, preempt, perhaps even reactively to all that may erupt, using the military instrument of power well embedded in a much wider integrated approach, then NATO can be successful. So don't start to and that's perhaps a bit of the militarization of the climate discussion. Don't do that, but in the first place, and make sure you become a leader in that field. That is what I would say. So define your own role and don't overplay your hand.
Yes, Elisa.
Yes, I just wanted to quickly come back on what Ben has just said, because it's a very, very crucial point, I think, when we talk about the question of how to bring allies together and basically have the same interest in this topic. Ben, you mentioned that's basically it's about what is NATO's core business, and NATO's core business is not to obviously solve the climate change or like the crisis. It's rather basically it's twofold. So on the one hand, of course, we are a player, an international player that is, as any other international organization, part of this challenge and of this responsibility to respond and help and mitigating climate change, play our part. And we know all that the military is a huge emission source. So yes, that is a role, but it is very important, I think, that we make clear to allies that there's a very integral self-interest for them in their role to address climate change in terms of security issues. So if we manage to get the narrative right to some of the nations who are just not convinced of why should NATO do something as well, and they do have a point. They do definitely have a point in terms of course, NATO cannot address all problems of the world because we only have a very bespoke mandate, and that's also a very important mandate. So we need to basically invoke the self-interest of nations to be like, oh, if we actually don't do anything about climate change, then the problem will come back to exactly NATO's mandate in terms of we won't be able to keep our people safe. So that's, I think, something which really needs to be distinct, that yes, NATO is one part of mitigation and like everyone else has to play its part, but NATO also needs to really be able to shape out and carve out its very unique role that it can play in actually addressing the climate change security risks. And if we make that clear to nations that they themselves should be interested in NATO getting involved in climate change security threats, then we have a better consensus than just trying to get them all on board to reduce emissions because it's our duty. So that's just an idea that I wanted to quickly bring to it.
Thank you to stressing up that reducing emission is our duty. I really like this sentence. So I would like to ask Tom if he has some other comment to the togetherness.
Yeah, what I've witnessed the last few years, that's very hard to get people on board on this, to recognize this climate security nexus. But I also see that once you start these debates and once you start explaining them why these are connected, they start recognizing it. And it's very important so to invest in awareness, not just to make new policies, but to trigger these debates within NATO and to invest in awareness. So if we could ask the intelligence communities to develop new assessments on the impacts of climate change, I think that would be a great message for countries to make it more relevant for them. I think it's also important to make clear to those countries that it does not replace current threats. Many countries are very concerned that this is a kind of a new topic that will get a new priority at the cost of other threats. That's not the case. Climate change is an integral part of all the threats that we face, and it's a threat multiplier of all the threats that we are already facing. So it helps us to put more emphasis on those threats. So we shouldn't see it as a threat in itself to do this debate. And the last thing I would like to say in this discussion, what we can also use is that we can see it as an opportunity when it comes to improving our operational effectiveness. By building our own self-sustainability, we can improve the operational effectiveness of all our capabilities. If we can build ships that don't have to bunker in every harbor that they run into, but have more endurance because they use new green technologies, then that has an operational benefit. If we can build bases that are self-sustaining, we don't need these big and very expensive logistic supplies, then that has an operational benefit. So I think we should also look at the positive side of this and try to communicate that. And last but not least, it's very important to show leadership. So we have some very good and leading countries now also leading efforts on climate and security. So let's put this on the agenda. Let's put their views on the agenda and trigger a positive debate.
Thank you so much to bring a bit positivity into this discussion. It's really important, and I totally agree that everything is about communication. We should not take someone behind us. We should be there together. And now I would like to give a floor to Sophia. Sophia, what do you think about togetherness?
I'll just try to add maybe 5 cents to everything what has been already mentioned, and trying to point out to the fact that NATO can be used sort of as a platform for those countries to debate and talk to each other. And trying to take an example, the famous debate, the 2% debate, which has been there for ages and which has already been a negative type of connotation, but trying to push and make it more a positive one, and trying to use it as an enhance towards those allies which potentially might not yet fully agree even on the emissions reductions, which is the basics as we have already discussed here, and trying to enhance those and, I don't know, shift the discussion of 2% towards making it more, in a way, if you do reduce the emissions and the greenhouse emissions, then the 2% target is going to be reached faster, or try to sort of use this carrot stick type of argument in a more carrot way rather than the stick one. But that might be one of the options from my side.
Yes, I would also like to stress that COP26 was kind of debate which was, I would say, even mainstream around the world, that a lot of people and policymakers were watching it. So I think this is kind of way how we can bring more togetherness into the climate change, and how can we be together, because it doesn't mean that if one country has one opinion, there is always contra argument somewhere else, and we should speak about it. I would like to go to the first speaker when we were touching upon the togetherness, and Ben, you mentioned that their militarization of climate discussion, that we should kind of avoid it. But when we are speaking about NATO, and NATO is a military organization, how can we actually avoid that? How can we avoid that the climate change will not be part of the militarization? Because when there are droughts, floods, etc., it means that immigration is happening, and then NATO has to come to the place. And we can also speak about the potential conflicts in the future when it comes to the climate change. So what do you think about the militarization of the climate change, and how can we avoid it, if there is any way, actually?
Yeah, Paul, how can we avoid it? I would honestly say that when I follow the debate in the newspapers and in the media, I think a lot of people that are involved in climate change, and don't get me wrong, but I often see that the discussion is very much caught between the tree huggers and the deniers, and there's little in between. Whereas I honestly feel that the solutions should always be in the middle. The solutions can never be found in the extreme. So I would say, let's avoid a discussion whether militarizing the climate or climatizing the military, but that there are serious security issues, and they will be accelerated by climate change. And I think step one is for the combined military, and NATO is a very strong alliance in that. And that's the point that Tom made as well. Advocate what you see happening in the world and what you see is a serious security risk. And then explain what it is that the military can do to create conditions for others to do their job. And I think when you look at humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, if we are present in areas where we see it happening, and I know that the Netherlands, France, and the UK have set up an organization in the Caribbean, so when hurricanes hit, we are prepared, we are going there together. If you are present somewhere, if you have the ability to move in, then move in as a sort of a first responder. Make sure that you establish a situation for others then to come in, and then the military could in fact step back. And I think in many crises you could see a same pattern, that military can create conditions for others to do their job, and I would very much promote that.
Thank you. Someone would like to interact when it comes to the militarization of climate change from other speakers? Yes, Tom?
No, I fully agree with what Ben said, and I think it's important that we don't see this as a military problem demanding a military solution. We should see this as a responsibility to be part of a wider team, to be part of a comprehensive effort with all kinds of other players. And these other players is not just the EU, it's also the fragile countries, it's also the businesses in the world with whom we can develop new technologies on the green area. It's also about developing new civil cooperation mechanisms in dealing with disaster relief and dealing with humanitarian crisis. It's also about building partnerships with these fragile regions and fragile countries. So by doing that, by approaching it in this way, I think we can avoid this picturing of we militarizing and hijacking the subject of climate change, which is absolutely not the case. And also in our communications, we need to be very sensitive about this and avoid the wrong words being used. And last but not least, I think we can, as I said before, we can be a very big driver of innovation. If we develop next generation naval vessels or next generation heavy vehicles with green technologies, these are all dual use technologies. So together with civil companies, we can help develop those kind of technologies which can be used very widely in the civil arena. So we can help them adapt and help them mitigate the climate change.
Yes, Elisa? You're muted, Elisa.
Oh, sorry, rookie error. I just wanted to come back on 2 points that Ben and Tom has said, but actually I found what Sophia has said before in terms of rather turning it around, not militarization of climate change, but climatization of security issues, is a very, very good point, because I don't think it's necessarily about militarization the problem. I think there will be no option for the military not to deal with the problems of climate change. And Ben and Tom, you've pointed it very well out how this will impact civil emergency disaster response mechanisms. So I think we've seen it also now with the pandemic for the first time, or not for the first time, but there was all of a sudden a very big need for the military to become involved in this pandemic crisis that was normally none of NATO's or military's mandate, but all of a sudden the military becomes again this framework in a society that is there to help citizens, that is there to make sure that actually lives are secured and that we as an alliance can live safely. So I think that's one point, that there will be that there will be no scenario where we can avoid that military and climate change have to basically find a way to align themselves with their mandate. I think one other point I have is what what Ben said before on contingency plans. That's one issue which I find very, very important in terms of how do we actually adapt, or how do we actually plan to adapt to the scenarios of climate change, let's say in 20 years in an operational perspective. And that's where I find the discussion within NATO either between allies or also within the organization itself, very interesting, because there's a big misunderstanding sometimes that people who say, hey, we need to do smart or green defense, we need to be able to actually both adapt military equipment to climate change, but also make it greener. I think there sometimes is this make it greener in the forefront of people's minds, and then a lot of, I'm sure Tom and Ben, you have a lot of military colleagues who then panic because the tank might not run on hybrid energy, and that's obviously not the point at all. There's so much need for us to actually rethink how will our airplanes, our military equipment actually work in an environment that is plus maybe if we are super optimistic, that is plus 1.5 degree. And so, but there are many other scenarios, especially for the areas where NATO does have operational interests, where the conditions will change significantly. So maybe half of the equipment that we currently use won't even be able to be operational anymore. So when we talk about how do we basically do contingency planning, how do we maybe adapt our military equipment to climate change, we need to look at it from both perspectives. They need to adapt because they might not be able to use them anymore, but they also, within this dual technology or dual use logic, they also might become much smarter by actually upgrading them to a emissions efficient way. And that's, I think, a very, very important point in a discussion, especially with military or with security-related professionals.
Thank you. I like that you touch upon the green defense, because actually I wanted to ask you about the green technology and green defense as your expertise in the hybrid threats. So you nicely cover it two in one. And please, Sophia.
Thank you. I would just I agree with all the points that have been mentioned before, but I would love to bring the debate also a bit to the core of the human security and remembering who are the people that are suffering the most and who are the ones who are greatly affected by the climate change. So I think when I was mentioning trying to avoid the securitization and militarization, it was sort of trying to remember that those are the people there and that we are responsible in front of them. And by trying, like, what not to do is sort of trying to avoid demilitarizing the national borders in a way that they would affect and make the conditions of those vulnerable people even worse for them. But I do agree with all the proposals that have been mentioned already before.
Thank you very much. And I have to also announce you that we have so many questions from the audience, actually. So let's jump into them. And the first question is, how are NATO's climate efforts synchronizing with the EU and other international organizations' efforts in this field? So as we may know that there is some NATO agenda, but as now we are living in globalization and there are so many other international organizations. So how can we actually synchronize all of this agenda, and how can we keep with some kind of navigation? Who would like to elaborate on this question first? Maybe I will ask you, Sophia.
Sure. I haven't been following that much on the cooperation between the EU and NATO recently, but I have been doing this for the past, before the whole COVID-19 started. So I would say that there is already quite a good ground for cooperation at the staff level, at the higher level between EU, NATO, between OSCE and NATO, UN and NATO. So the channels are already there. But from what I'm aware of, I'm not sure that climate change has been taken a good and relevant part in those type of discussions. So it's probably somewhere there mentioned at the background, but it's truly not the core of the discussions. So my response would basically be the channels are there. There are ways already. So people already do talk to each other, which I think is already quite a huge step forward. But bringing climate change and trying to be a bit more collaborative on that, especially maybe right now, while EU is trying to develop its own policies on how they want to bring climate change into its foreign and security policy, as well as NATO is only at doing the first baby step. So I think trying to avoid the previous mistakes when we try to, towards the end, think, oh, there are also others doing the job, but maybe try to bring it at the core in the beginning of the whole policy development and try to start talking to each other right now. So that would be my.
Thank you. I also agree that lessons learned are really important. And please, Ben, what do you have to tell about the international organizations?
Yeah, I honestly believe that cooperation between NATO and EU is stronger and getting stronger. There's lots of effort from both organizations to do that. And let's not forget that I'm losing count a bit, but 21 or 22 countries of both organizations are the same. So it would be odd if they would express an opinion that is different from what they do on the other side of town. What I find from own experience a bit difficult in the EU is that all security-related issues are part of the intergovernmental part, whereas all other areas are in the communautaire part, so the common decision-making. And here we see, and we see the same thing with cyber, for instance, but we see an area, climate change, that overlaps both the security and all other aspects of life. And the EU is split organizationally in those two. And I think that will be a major hurdle for the EU to take. That's perhaps outside the debate, but it is one thing to take into consideration.
Yes, that's very true. So, Tom, please.
Yeah, I think Ben and Eliza know more about the EU-NATO interaction, so I leave that to them. But I also want to point out the value of international conferences like this one we're in now. Because here you can have an open exchange of all kinds of insights and thoughts, and thereby stimulating policy development and feeding into policy development on all sides in all organizations. So I think these and I've witnessed that during the last few years, that these conferences are quite are like a think tank. You develop all kinds of ideas, and there are policymakers listening in, and they pick them up and they translate that into their policies. And I think these are also good platforms, like we are doing in our IMCCS organization, to exchange best practices between countries that overarch the boundaries of organizations like NATO and EU. We have a global network which enables us to also look at climate change from completely other angles, from other regions, and have completely other best practices on the table that we can use. So this interaction, I think, helps very much to synchronize efforts. Thank you.
Yes, I totally agree that as we also may see it with the globalization and with all of these international organizations, and somehow they are connected to each other. So like we can speak also about global civilization, where all of the agendas should go with each other alongside and no against. And last but not least, Eliza, please.
Yes, thank you. Just a quick note. I think obviously when we talk about synchronization or alignment of what the EU and NATO is doing, there's a big difference in what the EU is doing and can do and should do to combat climate change. And what we've now discussed in length is what is NATO's bespoke mandate and role with regards to climate change and security. So I think when we look at those two different roles, it should be the sweet spot of where are both organizations very, very important and where do both have strength and interest to work together. And in my opinion, that's mostly on the crisis response. So we've seen it with COVID. There was great cooperation, sometimes first time cooperation between many international organizations. And I think this should, if we look at climate change and what we've now talked about, the challenge of human security in the future, how can NATO leverage its super well equipped toolbox of crisis response and maybe train together with the EU, do exercises together with the EU, basically find the sweet spot of EU and NATO in terms of how do we align our efforts on combating climate change. And I think that will be in crisis response and civil emergencies.
Thank you. And Ben, do you have something to say, or it was you raised the hand?
No, I agree with Elisa, but that is exactly, I think, where some of the problems are, I think, in the EU. And let's not forget that the EU has many more policy instruments available that NATO has. But when you mentioned crisis response, as a military representative, I was invited once by DG ECHO, which is on the Commission side, to come and witness their ability. And I was almost forbidden because as a military representative to the EU, I'm in the intergovernmental part and not allowed to speak with the other side of the EU, which is a bit difficult to comprehend. I did go, by the way, but so when it comes to crisis response, NATO finds itself aligned with an organization within the EU, which is not their traditional speaking partner, so to say. So there are also organizational hurdles that we need to take. Nevertheless, I think there is already a lot of good cooperation in the way, and we should move that up, I think.
Yes, I totally agree. And there is another really nice question from our audience. And this question would go mainly to Tom and also Ben, because the last week I was part of the masterclass, which was organized exclusively for our patrons as well. And this question is navigating us to the Arctic operations. So how does the NATO climate plan translate into NATO Arctic operations? Please, Tom. Maybe you can start on the elaboration of this question.
Yes, well, of course, until now, the Arctic has not been a very big topic in NATO, also because there are separate mechanisms for the Arctic. There's a separate forum and a separate negotiation platform for dealing with the Arctic. But at the same time, we do have to recognize the enormous change that is happening there. As I said before, there is a completely new geopolitical arena opening up. There are big countries planting flags on the bottom of the ocean to claim resources, countries like Russia, China, but also Western countries like the US and several Scandinavian countries. So this is a source of friction in the future. And another change that it will bring is that it opens up completely new lines of communication over the north, new trading routes with China, and that also will lead to kind of a shifting balance of power in the world. So on a more strategic level, NATO needs to consider, okay, what is the impact of this change and how do we need to adapt to that? So there is a very big geopolitical dimension to climate change that affects the position of NATO, maybe even the disposition of NATO and its efforts. But it certainly demands more policy development with regard to the Arctic, and maybe even will lead to a repositioning of NATO assets to deal with it.
Yes, thank you. I really liked the elaboration of geopolitical dynamic. And as Elisa also has kind of expertise in geopolitics, maybe you can elaborate a bit on this topic as well.
Yes, I think what is very interesting with the Arctic especially is, and I'm sure Ben and Tom know much more about this from a military perspective, but obviously the topic of Russia, Sophia has touched upon it before, is very different from what NATO would consider in terms of how climate change is impacting the security and basically has to be wants to be part of this fight against climate change. For Russia, the strategic calculus is very different because if the Arctic is ice-free, that's amazing because it opens up more sea routes that give Russia much more leverage over actually controlling trade routes, obviously also establishing new military routes, being able to do entirely different strategic calculations on how quickly deployments can be made. So, and we must almost say, even though Russia has luckily turned around in the last years and is now also committed to fighting climate change, for a long time for Putin, climate change was almost a present for Russia because a lot of the rising temperatures, especially in the east of Russia is going to make land more habitable, more will be better for farming. Obviously, there's a lot of downsides. So luckily, yes, Russia has now also seen that it's not the winner of climate change, but unfortunately, it will have a very, very big impact on how NATO or how NATO allies will be able to negotiate with Russia and also China on this Arctic issue, because unfortunately for China and Russia, having an ice-free Arctic is not the worst thing that they can think of in terms of geopolitical calculations. And I think that's going to be a very, very tricky and a very, very sensitive issue to negotiate and navigate for NATO allies, because it's very obvious what will be problems that NATO then has to face. So I find it a very interesting perspective, and I would like to see what Ben says in terms of what's a military way out of this dilemma of basically telling Russia that it's not good for them that the Arctic is ice free.
Yes, please, Tom.
Yeah, I think for more than one reason, this is very interesting, and I would say that probably this is the one of the better arguments, if you already need one, to really start to decrease or basically nullify our reliance on fossil fuel, because not only does the thawing permafrost allow Russia to produce much more grain, and they're already using the grain as a strategic tool, but it also opens up extra possibilities for exploration of oil and gas. So if we don't need oil and gas anymore, then that problem is off the table. Now, Russia has a lot of other vested interest in that region, but I would say anywhere in the world you go and you find clashes over borders, most of them are maritime borders, whether it's the Eastern Mediterranean or the South China Sea or the Arctic, and most of it's about resources, and most of that is oil and gas resources. So if you need an argument extra to nullify your need of oil and gas, then here you have it.
Yes, Elisa, you wanted to come back to something.
Yes, thank you. I found that a very interesting point, because I'm completely with you, and that's obviously the most logic conclusion. However, I also think it's very interesting how this autumn we've seen how quickly nations are already then outpaced a bit by the developments of the energy market. So we've seen a huge energy crisis, which for allies has resulted mostly in a electricity crisis and in a price crisis. So it wasn't about scarcity of gas; it was just about distribution and also miscalculation. So all of a sudden, due to the pandemic, people had to heat more their homes. They used more electricity. At the same time, the weather didn't play into the cards of renewable energies. There was less wind, hence much lesser renewable energies. And all of a sudden, this great plan of, we're going to do renewable energy transition. It's going to be great. The EU is now like plowing forward and with the green plan, the Green Deal. And all of a sudden, it's Russia who is the savior of the time, because Nord Stream 2 can be quickly opened to help the Europeans out of this pickle, which they have put themselves in by miscalculating the energy needs and by also not facing the very uncomfortable truth of what energy transition will mean, because there will be, in the short term, there will be probably an increase of gas resources needed and oil resources needed. And I think the challenge here will be how to communicate this to the public, because it's one side to say, Green Deal, and yes, the pandemic has shown us we now need to definitely fight climate change, but then still have projects like Nord Stream 2. And I'm not saying I'm not even sometimes convinced it's just a bad project. It's in many instances, obviously, a very geopolitical tool as well that has very many other factors except for energy resources to be factored in. But I think this will be the key challenge for policymakers in the coming 10 years at least, to on the one hand say, yes, we need to get away from traditional energy resources, but until we have enough of the other stuff that we actually then want to go to. So it's going to be a very tricky route in terms of strategic communications, I think.
Yes, I totally agree. And thank you for this brainstorming discussion and answering the questions of our audience. Unfortunately, the time is running really fast. I feel like I would be here with you even for 1 more hour because we get so many other interesting questions that can be also addressed. But maybe in our spring conference the next year, we can again assemble together on the topic of the climate change. So just to briefly wrap up, I think that the NATO is doing a good job when it comes to the togetherness because we are stronger together. And all of you had really interesting visions and recommendations what it comes to NATO and the climate change as such. Even though all of you coming from the different backgrounds, you were kind of elaborating on this question which I posed to you in different sense, but I think that all of you had kind of consensus in that all of the nations should come together and have a debate, have a conversation, because climate change is posing the geopolitical insecurity to all of us, not only to international organizations, but also to people around the globe. So I would like to thank you to all of you, all of the 4 speakers which came today to tackle the issue of the climate change, and also of the Atlantic Forum that provided platform for us for the young professionals and for the experts to come together and to exchange their opinions, and also to Petra, our chair of the conference and a project management team. So thank you for this experience. I don't know if you have something really briefly to take on. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.